Hey guys, it's Micah Young, the host of another Philosophical Tuesday. Thank you for joining us as we open another can of philosophical worms. In today's podcast, we discuss the importance of narrative and stories in shaping our psyche. Specifically, we discuss concepts such as the timeless elements of good stories, the incorporation of the trickster, and the extremes of order and chaos. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoy this episode. And we're live. Welcome to another Philosophical Tuesday, where we talk about philosophy on days that aren't Tuesday, because we've never recorded this on a Tuesday, and I doubt we ever will record this on a Tuesday, and it would be pretty ironic. I am here with, their names are both Josh, but today the first and foremost of the Joshes is our mighty tech leader, Mr. Joshua Charlton. How are you doing today, Joshua Charlton?
Oh, I'm doing phenomenal, and as your mighty tech leader, let me just say, my audio is working today.
It is.
It wasn't.
That's good to know.
It wasn't. Well, I unplugged it by mistake. See, as the mighty tech leader actually isn't very good with technology. That's the dirty little secret here. But yeah, your mighty tech leader is here with the other lesser of the two Joshes. They are our wonderful, beautiful, and soul married member, Josh Smith.
I am wonderful and beautiful, but lesser. I love it. Well, I will take that, because apparently I'm the most humble of the Joshes as well. So, yeah, there's that. At least
I also am the most humble of the Joshes by far.
No, it's not even a contest.
I exude humility
There's no way.
constantly.
Guys, we all know I'm the most humble of the Joshes, so this isn't even a competition.
You know what? I actually can't argue with that. I fully accept that.
Well, anyways, I am here today with our host, Micah Young, who is going to lead us into a very probably complicated discussion on storytelling.
Well, why did you just steal my thunder and introduce the podcast topic for me? I mean, it's not like we didn't say at the end of the last podcast that this is what we would be talking about this week. So now they've heard it twice. I don't need to tell it to them.
Since you said you were the most humble, I figured you didn't mind if I introduced it for you.
I'm the most humble Josh, all right? It has nothing to do with my humility as a Micah.
Okay, that's very fair.
I accept that as well.
Okay, all right. I'm glad to know I'm acceptable in your eyes, Joshua Charles.
You are, Micah, you have always been acceptable in my eyes. And nothing more.
And on that note, today we're going to be talking about stories and the philosophy of stories, and hopefully having a more serious conversation than this.
Doesn't hurt to add a
This is
little
all
humor.
this podcast is going to be, let's be honest.
I mean, there's a reason we're calling this channel the Intellectual Stooges. I mean, originally we were going to call the podcast that, but...
We needed some sound effects.
We're still the Intellectual Stooges. We just have a particular
we have a
show
particular
called...
thing we do on not Tuesday.
Yeah. We have other shows, we'll call them other things.
Maybe someday, if we get lots of followers, we can record this live on Tuesdays. And
that would be awesome.
We'll actually be this is actually on Tuesdays now.
Yeah.
And
okay.
It'll be a huge deal when we finally move this to actual Tuesdays.
I know. I mean, right now we're recording it on Mondays and Thursdays, and maybe someday we'll record it on a Wednesday, but never a Tuesday.
Yeah.
All right. So we're going to talk about stories. Last week we were talking about philosophy and why we do philosophy. What's the point of a philosophical pursuit, and what is to be gained by not just living out a philosophy, not just having a philosophy, because everyone has a philosophy and everyone lives one out. What's to be gained by discussing philosophy? And so today we're going to kind of push that conversation in a direction that it sort of came up last week, but in the direction of stories. So moving on from philosophical conversation, how do stories convey the love of wisdom? The study of wisdom in the pursuit of virtues and what is right and good.
Well, and I think we can start addressing that by tying it in with the discussion of personality. We had our first discussion about parenthood. We brought up the fact that there's the tendency for certain children to end up becoming productive members of society and others becoming quite annoying or unproductive members of society. And to connect that to stories, I think we could all agree that in a certain sense, the characters in stories can represent our own person, like the person inside of us. We can be the hero. We can do productive and meaningful things, and we can come to the rescue of those who need it. Or we can be the trickster, the villain, and do unproductive and chaotic things. And so I think that's part of the reason why stories fundamentally have to do with good and evil, is because there is something heroic and something quite evil in all of us.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. You know, I really do think that the stories, and particularly the most old and fundamental stories, you know, the kind of archetypal stories, point to incredibly deep truths about human nature, and truths that are so real that we've been retelling the same stories for as long as we've been telling stories. They're that powerful and they're that true. And I think I said last time that these stories are in many sense, you know, they're more real than reality. They speak to truths that are so real that they transcend any one particular example of their bearing out. And that does speak to people.
So how does that happen? How does a story, you know, get to how and why is there such a in stories such this grand ideal, such this grand, you know, the obvious heroic character who's good, and the obvious evil and malicious character or villain, you know, how do we as a culture subconsciously infuse these stories with that wisdom, you know? How does that happen?
Part of it has to do with community ethics. We pronounce certain things as societally good and noble, and other things as societally bad or destructive. I think it might be easier to get into this discussion with some examples. The story of Aladdin, for instance. I mean, it's the characters are a bit exaggerated in Aladdin. Like, Jafar is this really evil tyrant. But I mean, I think it's pretty clear that that movie is not completely denouncing true leadership. Jafar tries to be a leader, but he ends up unleashing his true colors, which is this giant serpent. And so that's what happens when leadership is done without showing any humility or willingness to work with others.
How these things came about is a question that philosophers and psychologists that are much smarter than any of us here have been wrestling with for as long as we've realized that this is a part of these stories, that these things are present in these stories. You know, if you want a good book on this, you'll read Jung's Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious, which is exactly about this very topic, and how, and specifically about how these things came about and how they evolved over time. So it's a my concern with this conversation is that it's so, particularly with a question like that, you could fill volumes and volumes on that question.
Yeah.
And I for one just feel woefully unprepared to tackle it. Really.
That's fair.
And that's why this is in no way supposed to be comprehensive. It's just some thoughts that we're spilling out. We're just talking. And perhaps all we're doing is speaking nonsense.
There's going to be a lot of that.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of that. But I mean,
Well, we all know I'm acceptable and absolutely nothing more than acceptable. So as Josh established,
It's your best quality.
I'm the most acceptable person, and I'm nothing better than that. Honestly, I don't think I could complain about that. I think if I could be an acceptable person, I would consider that quite a success.
Mm.
No, I mean, no, I agree. It's a lot to get into. I just didn't know if maybe we could toy with the edge of this topic, because you're right. Stories are a big topic, and much work has been done, especially by Jung, and it's just something that Jordan Peterson talks a lot about is the power of stories, and the truths that are woven into stories. It's
well, and
it's interesting.
Even just to interrupt, it doesn't even need to be a literal story. It doesn't need to be a book. It doesn't need to be completely fictitious.
Well, I mean, say you're writing a novel, and this is, that is a story. It is a book. And this is the modern example I can think of. You're writing a novel, and you're trying to tell a good story. You're trying to convey a rising action, a falling action, a plot, some sort of conflict and some sort of resolution. You're going to end up having the characters do things that you don't necessarily understand why you're having the characters do those things. You understand that they're going somewhere. You're going to introduce a conflict. The character's going to have to deal with that conflict, and they may deal with it in a good way. They may deal with it in a bad way at first, and then come into understanding a good way to deal with it, and they may fail. But the character's going to have to deal with a conflict. And you're going through the writer, the storyteller, now making it broader than just writing a novel, looking back at the stories that have been told and passed down throughout human history. You're going to breathe into that character some articulation of what ought to be done, of what the thing is that should be done. And you're not going to be able to necessarily articulate as the storyteller, or even understand as the storyteller, why that is the case, but you still know it to be the case. And the stories that have staying power are the ones where people agree that that is the case, or even modify the story such that it becomes more true and more meaningful and on a deeper level. I mean,
there's a sense in which the writer isn't writing the story; they're just telling it.
Yeah. It's almost something that the writer is trying to grasp. Something out there that he knows is beyond him. Because, and this makes sense if you look at it this way. You can write a bad story or you can write a good story. The good story will be one in which the writer was able to formulate the correct things in the right way it was a convincing narrative, the way he pieced it all together, and he could just as easily approach the same topic or same narrative and piece it together so horribly that no one reads it. And that's because there's something to the story that's beyond the writer. He has the ability to convey the message. It's not fully within his power, I don't think, to write the perfect story, because I don't know, just playing with an idea.
Well, the question would be what is the perfect story?
That's a good question.
And maybe it was already written.
Care to elaborate?
Well, maybe the reasons why we're retelling the same stories over and over and over again is that the paramount story, the archetypal story, is fundamentally a telling of the human condition in all of its in its truest and most again, I'll use that word archetypal. It's archetypal form. And we keep telling that same story over and over and over and over and over again in a million different ways, a million different settings with a million different characters, but it's the same story. Maybe all we're doing is telling that story because it is the perfect story. It is the most true, fundamentally true story. And it's interesting because you can see that you can see that story throughout, different cultures and civilizations over thousands of years. It's in all of the mythologies. It's the same story over and over and over and over again.
Can we begin to... Go
Sorry,
ahead.
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask, can we begin to, if we're going to talk about this, can we begin to describe the story? It doesn't have to be exhaustive, but what is this story?
Well, I think part of it is it's the story of each individual and the struggle against existence.
To boil that down, it's the knight leaves the walled city to go kill the dragon and rescue the princess. It's that story. And it's been told 1,000 times over and over and over again. It's in the mythologies, it's in the religions. It's that same story. There's a hero. He's in a relatively safe-ish place, but not really because there's stuff lurking outside of the immediate safety. He leaves the immediate safety of the place that he's been in, usually under the guidance of someone more aged and more experienced, and the combination of the youthful, fresh eyes of the hero and the experience of the ages that has been given to him by the elder gives him the power to go out, slay the dragon, and rescue the damsel, or get the treasure, or whatever the great reward is at the end. And then he comes back and he takes his rightful place as king of the civilization, and he leads the civilization using those same very principles. And it's that same story. It is every founding story. It is every religion. It is all that story.
No, I don't think you can come up with a story that you would consider a good story that doesn't at least very, very closely fit that exact pattern. I certainly can't just sitting here running through a couple in my head. I think of the story of Dune. I think the story of Star Wars.
Lord of the Rings.
It's all the same story.
Lord of the Rings. Actually, the interesting thing about Lord of the Rings is that Peter Jackson actually did that with Aragorn's character far more than Tolkien did. Tolkien wrote Aragorn's character as somebody who was already wanted to be king, was already ready to be king. And it makes you wonder if there was in any way an improvement on the story by making that out of Aragorn's character. But we don't need to get into the specifics of stories, but that's...
Well, examples can be helpful too. Of course, people can analyze for themselves, like this pattern, and see which stories fit into it. But I think you're right. I think that is a fundamental story. And most good stories, any good story that I can think of off the top of my head is going to follow that pattern, at least loosely. And I mean, of course, it's not going to be that exact, like, narrow-minded pattern for everything. Like, at the end of Lord of the Rings, the hobbits return to the Shire, and everything isn't peaceful again. They have to fight off Saruman, and chaos has erupted back home too. And it's kind of a reminder that once you've won the battle, you still have to go fight the mini battles back at home.
What's so interesting about that is it's a cycle.
Yeah,
right. It doesn't. You go through the story once, and then it starts over again. It never ends. And again, but they all still follow that pattern. It's this undeniable internal truth that we keep circulating around cross-culturally, cross-racially. It's everywhere, and again, that's why I say it is the greatest story ever written. It is the perfect story. It's already been written.
And I think part of the reason that it is such a profound story is because it is basically what every struggle to obtain something good in life looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever it is in life, when you're trying to complete college, when you're, I don't know, like, I can't think of any examples, but like in life, when hardship arises, you need to do what you described. You need to fight the dragon. And
I mean, this was our conversation last week, right? We talked about the value of philosophy being a tool in order to gain wisdom in order to deal with the hardships of life. What are you doing in the pursuit of philosophy? You're staking your ideas. You're going outside of the nice little walled city that you built that comprises your worldview, and you're stepping outside of that into the wild wilderness of ideas. You are tackling the unknown in that, the dragons that lurk in that, with all the experience that you have and all the experience of the ages, and you are, if you're doing it properly, you find something of value at the end that you can come and take back to your city, and it becomes stronger as a result of that, and then you do it again.
And you need to keep doing it. And only once you've been willing to encounter the unknown and to build yourself up to face the dragon, will you be rightfully acceptable to be able to face the dragon. Because at the beginning of the story, you're not ready to face the dragon. That's the whole point of the story. The story is not about you're home, and then you fight the dragon, and then you're back home. A major part of the story is the progress leading up to the fight with the dragon. Of course, what you want is the end.
And you might say that the process can be delineated down into that combination of the fresh eyes of the youth and the wisdom of the ages.
Well,
that's why there's always that mentor figure.
And that's why there's always conservatives and liberals, because liberals are like the young voices that want to change the world, and conservatives are it's the tried and true method that has worked in the past. And so that's the same archetype as the mentor figure who keeps the young rogue in check, and the young rogue who has fresh eyes and wants to try all the new techniques and needs to be kept in check, otherwise he'll die too early in the story and then there won't be a story. And so that's the whole point of like conservatives and liberals. It's a projection of the personal, of each person's story and their desire to have personal achievements and conquer personal goals. They're projected into stories.
Yeah, tradition will stagnate if it is left to itself. If only the old are left with their tradition, it will just, this is where the safety of the city walls becomes the stagnation within the city walls, where corruption seeps in, and but then the fresh eyes of the youth, the willingness to take risk breathes life into things, but it must be held in check. Otherwise, it will destroy itself.
And everything around them.
It's just another way of putting what you just said.
Yeah, it is. And there's the tendency.
And I like that. Everything around them. I like that. I think that's aptly put.
Trying to think of some good examples, because I feel like examples would make this more visually helpful.
I mean, think about. You see this. We were talking about this, a couple of weeks ago in terms of how people parent. It's like you see this in parenting styles. I mean, people will be follow the more traditional route with their parenting, where they're laying down, the expectations of this is the tried and true way to. This is teaching their kids. This is the tried and true way to live their life, and if they push that too hard, the children will either just kind of assimilate into that and become nothing more than a repeater and a bearer of the tradition. And they will not add to it. They will only lose the learned experience with it. But then again, if the tradition is not pushed, if the children are merely expected to drive on and explore and not to take risks, but not to weigh the risks, they will lose all the good that was to be had from the tradition and from the experience.
Well,
it's only through a balance that. And go ahead, Josh.
Well, I was going to say,
say
therein lies the profundity of the pattern that Charlton pointed out, because it's a lot of the times, as you pointed out, Micah, it's the stricter parents, the more conservative ones, who don't expose their children to any sort of risk or any sort of new experiences in life. And what often happens then is children aren't prepared, they aren't equipped to be able to go on the journey. They aren't equipped to tackle the intense responsibilities of adult life. But on the other hand, the parents who do not mentor the children, that do not guide them along the way, are not showing them the tried and true methods that have worked. They're not equipping them with the resources necessary to be able to fight these dragons. They're just throwing them out of the city walls and saying, go fight the dragon, but they're giving them no resources to be able to do so. And
all the kids get eaten.
Yeah, the kids get eaten by the dragon, and the dragon just accumulates more and more wealth, gets more and more powerful until hopefully one mentor out there is willing to take on the challenge of guiding this exceedingly annoying young person towards fighting the dragon.
I will graciously assume the role of guide in both of your lives.
We're screwed.
Oh well.
It's very interesting because I think of it makes me think of when kids go off to college. In a certain sense, that is leaving the city walls.
Mm-hmm.
It's leaving the safety and comfort of being at home. Now, the dragon you're going out to slay may depend on your circumstances.
It might just be a worthless diploma.
It might be a worthless diploma. It might be, there's all kinds of different ways we could go with this. But I think for the kids who grow up in that sort of safe haven, I think it's not until they leave that safe haven that they really do. I think this is true for any child who grows up in a home where they are more or less well taken care of, is they have to go outside of the city walls and take risk and be exposed to the world in order to, in order to have any chance of slaying the dragon.
Well, and I think a lot of the time, the most difficult dragon to defeat is a part of yourself. And that's something that is shown in some of the best movies and books. It's really you who have been the problem all along. And a lot of times it's not explicitly made clear in books or movies that the dragon is part of you. But there's a part of you that is perhaps malicious and deceitful and greedy and hoards things like a dragon and is cruel and wicked and all that kind of stuff. The person who ends up being the hero of the story can't be a hero until he recognizes that and somehow learns to take on responsibility necessary to be able to become the hero rather than drifting to the side of the villain.
And you know what's interesting about that kind of story is that the hero in that story achieves victory often not by destroying his internal demons, but by properly integrating them into himself.
Yes.
And that's an interesting difference, that it's not just the destruction of the kind of darker parts of yourself. Although there are elements of that, and there are some demons that do need to be destroyed, and I think that's clear too. But sometimes what's needed isn't just the pure destruction of them, but the proper integration. If you're angry all the time, the solution is not to never be angry. It's to properly integrate that anger into your life, to be angry at the right things and be angry righteously as opposed to unrighteously. It's not just a dismissal of that part of yourself. So it is interesting that It's kind of a difference in the
Yeah, it
way
is.
of telling the story.
And I've definitely, I think you could definitely draw another allusion to Aladdin with that one, where he's like a thief and just a no good rapscallion, right? And he kind of puts on this facade of being a prince that's worthy of a princess. And when he ends up fighting the dragon at the end, he doesn't just completely throw his wit aside, throw aside his like sneaky ways. I from what I remember, he outwits the dragon, but he does so in a way that shows strength of character, something that he had not shown before throughout the movie. And so it's this integration of the part of him that is sneaky and witty into the part of him that has strength and resolution to fight for a cause that he finds noble. Once those are integrated together, then he's able to finally defeat the dragon, and therefore he's able to ascend to the role of king rather than just being the fake prince.
Well, I mean, you know, there's the wonderful story of the slaying of Medusa.
Right.
You know, the hero kills Medusa, yes, but he doesn't destroy her. He takes its head, and proceeds to use it in future confrontations. You know, it's not just the destruction of the evil, but it's the remaking of it into something good.
That's true.
It's I mean, the greatest hero is simply he who makes order out of chaos, right? Isn't that the greatest hero?
I mean, ultimately, that's what it takes to defeat the dragon. I mean, it's to use the spirit of youth, to defeat the dragon, but to at the same time put away the chaos of youth, to do so in a control isn't the word, in a what's the word? In a fashion that is I guess controlled. There's a word I'm trying to think of, but it's not coming to me. Anyway,
That was a very acceptable answer, Micah.
Quite acceptable.
I'm glad to hear it meets the expectations of the acceptable.
It was almost amazing, but it was acceptable.
It never exceeded acceptable, which is.
I mean, I couldn't think of the word, so if that's acceptable, I'd consider that a good thing, I guess.
The point you made was acceptable. You know, it wasn't great, but it was acceptable, and I accept that. Just like I accept you,
Micah. You are the acceptable hero of this podcast.
I'm God made me special, and He loves me just the way I am.
He made you acceptable.
Micah, you have now been degraded to unacceptable.
No. He's still acceptable.
Okay.
I can't go up and I can't go down.
He can't go up. He can't go down. He's just.
I'm in limbo.
He's in limbo.
I'm hanging out here with Plato and Aristotle and all the philosophers. I'm here in limbo. I don't get to see heaven, but I don't have to suffer through hell. Everything is acceptable.
Everything's acceptable.
Sounds amazing.
Oh man.
Well, so just had this thought. Well, guess this is something I wanted to share because it's what I worked on for my senior project. I basically was doing some research on the rise of democracy in India, and so I was looking at the mutiny of 1857, where the Indian soldiers rebelled against the British East India Company, and I was kind of blown away when I was doing some research for this project on how throughout the world these mutinous, quote unquote mutinous Indian soldiers were used to invoke certain imagery about the way that Easterners were or the way that modern society was. And I think this connects to our discussion today because So this was like these were actual events that transpired in which the Indian sepoys rebelled against the British, and the term sepoy came to be used as like a symbol of rebellion or a symbol of anti-colonialism. And it just kind of blew me away how narratives can be twisted to promote whatever propaganda fits people's causes. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is that a narrative can be something more than just a fictional story. Oftentimes narratives spring from like real world events that often shape the way that a collective views something. And I don't know, eventually, like, as I was reading a lot for this, it just seemed like that a lot of thinkers such as Gandhi saw these rebels as kind of symbolic of the influx of democracy into the Western world, which is quite crazy because it was just a really small rebellion. But it's just a way that, like, the mythology behind the actual events influenced the way that people saw things.
So I have a question, because this is interesting. I feel like you've kind of gone on both perspectives here. To what extent do you think you take an event like that? An event like that is placed as maybe the formation, a formative event in the construction of a mythology, you might say.
Yes.
Right? So to what extent do you think an event like that is integrated into the creation of a mythology or a story, versus to what extent do you think an event like that is itself inspired and caused by the underlying ideals of a mythology or a story?
I think it's almost entirely caused by some sort of narrative, by some sort of kind of the same pattern we were looking at before, how things come full circle. It's not that this specific revolution created a new idea. It's not that modern democracy is a fundamentally new idea. I think what happens is it often looks like an event creates new ideas or new narratives that drive people because it's just come full circle. It's responded to events and stories before that, and it ends up influencing people through that story, who then go on their own journey and then create their own story that's a spin-off of that story. It just keeps going down the line.
Look at the example of this in our culture, the American Revolution being a good one.
Yeah.
The American Revolution is what, for many Americans at least, is viewed as this ideal of throwing off tyranny and fighting for individual rights and for freedoms and representation in government. There's so many things tied up into it. That's not the point of what I'm saying. But those ideas were not born out of the American Revolution. They fed into the American Revolution and were born out of the colonists coming over from their various nations to escape things in their various nations and coming to escape tyranny I mean regardless of whether you agree with that narrative or not, that is the narrative, right? And that is not only what fueled the revolutionaries. It then fueled the story that became the revolution, and then that really took on that strong sense of throwing off tyranny and of championing freedom above all else.
Are you calling British people dragons?
No, and that's the interesting thing about this. And it would be very interesting you could get into this as a more specific example, and you kind of hinted at this with the mutiny in India, but it's like people will take stories and will manipulate them to fit their own narrative and to fit the narrative of their culture and their society. Whereas in India, this was a a call for democracy, a push for democracy. It represented the rise of democracy. In other parts of the world that may have been more imperialist, it represented the savageness of the natives. It represented the disorder that was in existence without the presence of the the civilized man coming in and taking over.
Right, and that's actually, like, if you read British sources at that time, they're writing about these bloodthirsty savages who are out to eat your children. And if you read about it from the Indian side, the British soldiers were like mutilating people and definitely abusing their power, and it was basically strength in numbers against the British, because the British had all the weaponry. So it's very different stories depending on who you ask.
It makes it hard to actually, when you're dealing with an event that took place like that, and you've got these two sides that are so conflicting, it makes it hard to actually figure out what was really going on.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then it becomes the problem becomes compounded when you have historians writing about it from an American perspective, and they don't know whose side to choose, and so they just kind of exaggerate anything they can get their hands on.
It's like you're basing history on mythology. You know, it
history
really is like
mythology.
That.
Well,
and
it's actually amazing.
It is. It's the mythology of the victors.
Some of the most some of the most renowned and famous historians of all time have been the greatest embellishers. They have created a romantic picture of how the world looks, especially when it comes to Europeans writing about South America or North America before they were colonized. Like, it was the most...
Christopher Columbus discovered that the world was round. Didn't you know that?
Exactly. Like...
Like, really. People are taught this in school still.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's...
Well, I mean, it's and there may be some credit to some of these things, but it's like, I mean, how idealized is the American Revolution? How idealized is the Union in the Civil War? You know, how idealized are the Allies in World War II and in World War One? You know,
and these demonized the other side.
And how demonized is the other side? I mean, that is the other side.
Part of it goes back to the fact that everything's a story. Because everyone wants to imagine that they're on the side of the hero. They're on the side of the...
Of course.
Well, first of all, they all want to be the victors. So you can rewrite history so that you were the victor, you got all the spoils, and the other guy was the dragon that ended up getting defeated. But then when you kind of mess around with narratives like that, a Hitler rises up and says, you guys cheated, like this is not fair, and then gets people to fight back against that. So it just kind of... Go ahead.
I have a question. Why do we feel the need, as a species, to make stories out of things instead of just telling the kind of empirical, factual, historical record? Why do we make stories?
It's more
out
interesting.
of these things?
Because why would it be useful to us if there's not some sort of value judgment attached to it?
Well,
I mean, this is information.
Does a good story really
seriously
focus on value judgments, though?
Well, why would I care what happened in the American Revolution if it has absolutely no implications for what I'm going to do in my day-to-day life? I mean, it would be good to know that something happened, but unless it's my job to know things that happened, unless it's literally my job to know the facts about what happened, it is completely and utterly useless to me.
Right, but my question is, should the value judgments be explicit in stories, or should they be derived by the viewer who has seen the way events transpired and interpreted them for themselves?
How can you tell a story and not imbue value judgment into it?
I'm not saying...
Other than simply relaying facts. How can you convey to somebody that a story is important without attaching some sort of value judgment to it?
That's true.
Because otherwise, again, you're just spouting off facts.
And I have a theory behind this that I think explains why it is we have to do this. Why it's impossible to convey a story just based on the facts. And I think bias has to come out in that. And I think the primary reason for that is that reality is so infinitely complex that there is no possible way for a single human being to fully wrap their head around it or fully convey it in any real sense. So we have to. I mean, the stories are often just oversimplifications
Yes.
of infinitely complex reality. And the way that we simplify these stories is going to be influenced by the values that we pre-read into it. So even if you convey a story that seemingly has no bias behind the way that you've conveyed that information, by the nature that you have simplified the story in such a way that it necessarily includes some things and not others, your bias is revealed.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the very
Absolutely.
nature of attempting to take away all value out of a narrative is making a value judgment about something in a narrative. So it's kind of self-contradictory to try to do that.
It's like how people use statistics in modern times. It's like everyone loves statistics. They love to throw statistics around because we like to assign this characteristic of empirical data to something, and that means you can argue with it. It's the science. People love to do this with science and statistics. Is they will tell a story, and they will tell the story as if it's the facts, and it is the facts. But it's only part of the facts.
Yeah, but it's always convenient that the facts tell your story.
But that's the thing. Why would I want to tell you the facts? Why would I want to tell you that the grand evil villain who I'm trying to paint as this person that you would never want to be like also has this underlying motivation that's actually that's actually nuanced and complex. I mean, that's hard to deal with. Now, that doesn't mean we just assume that everyone who's doing something evil has this nuanced reason for doing it. But it's interesting that at least in the traditional way of telling the story, we ignore that.
And to some extent you have to, because otherwise the story becomes way too complicated to grasp, and way too complicated to write, and way too complicated to condense into a 1,000-page novel or a 3-hour movie. So,
and the truth that is being conveyed by the story is not that there is nuance in the world. And this is what has happened, I think, with a lot of modern storytelling, is we like nuanced villains and we like nuanced heroes. We like the heroes who are actually doing something wrong some of the time. We like the villains who are actually have some motivations that we can identify with. Why do we like that? Because the value of the story has become the nuance. It's not because we're trying to be intellectually honest about what's going on. It's because the actual value that the story is trying to convey is that not everything is black and white. And that's not a bad value to convey, but if that's all the story is that you're telling, then that's all. This is what's happening with our culture right now. It's the primary value has become that not everything, that truth is not absolute, right? Mm-hmm. That there are not absolute virtues, absolute good and absolute evil. But the point of conveying absolute good and evil in a story is not to say that there is no nuance to the world. It is simply to identify in the form of a story, without articulating explicitly what is the good and what is the evil, articulating it through imagery of a story. This is what is good. This is what is evil. These aren't humans that we're portraying. We're portraying the idealized human. We're portraying the idealized good and the idealized evil. We know it's not that simple. That's not the point of the story. The point of the story is to convey the ideal.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think it's interesting to see a lot of the movies you're describing that tend to focus on breaking out of the black and white standardized movie script, you know? Mm-hmm. But I think there are also some ways to approach that in a nuanced fashion that still get at some absolute values. So like Shrek, for instance, is a fabulous movie. It's a wonderful movie. And in Shrek, the whole point is kind of making fun of your average fairy tale, and Shrek is this ogre from the swamp rather than this knight in shining armor. And yet Shrek still has to adopt certain responsibilities and act like a hero to be able to marry the princess. It's not like he abdicates
so funny?
all his duties and then gets crowned king.
What's so funny about Shrek is that it is still an archetypal story. It makes fun of archetypal stories,
yes.
But it self-recognizes the necessity of being one. Shrek is still an archetypal character. Even while he's making fun of them, he is one.
Yeah, and
it's interesting because the mentor character for Shrek is the archetype.
Yeah,
it is the archetypal story. It is.
Okay, we're getting too meta.
No, Shrek's getting Shrek's
You're
just
thinking
too
of
meta.
Shrek,
Shrek's
and
just the meta.
that's taking it in a slightly different direction. I was thinking actually of the villain side of this, which might be, and it's not exactly the opposite side of this. It's more. I was thinking of Thanos, and the fact that there's a lot of attempt to portray Thanos' motivations in destroying half of all life on Earth, in the universe, as being somewhat noble. He's trying to prevent suffering, for example. He actually wants to do this. He has this idea in his head. He wants to do this good thing. There's that nuance there.
Well, the best
But
villains
there's
are
a
the ones that think they're fighting for a good cause.
That's true. And that's where you get these more complex villains. But the thing that is ultimately determined by literally everyone else in the universe who's fighting Thanos on this is that regardless of how high the ideal, the ends don't justify the means. And I think that's actually one of the main points of the story of the last two Avengers movies. And unfortunately, I think from here we're gonna stop seeing good storytelling and start seeing a lot more scrambling for cash. But I
disagree.
That's
the last two
point.
Avengers movies were in any way good storytelling. But continue.
Well, I'm not saying that they were good storytelling in and of in as much as the movies themselves were good stories. They were wrapping up this overarching story arc and still managed to put forward some absolutes, which is that regardless of how evil, how challenging the evil and how and how even nuanced the intentions of the evil might be, that it's important to continue fighting that.
All right.
But we can get into the details of the Avengers.
I'm gonna
what
put it
point
out
the
there.
archetypal becomes the cliche.
Come on, Josh. I'm just gonna put it out there. We don't watch the Marvel movies for their good stories. It's a bunch of famous actors with badass suits, and that's why we watch Avengers.
Pretty much.
Yeah. No, you're right.
It's Tony freaking Stark. We're gonna watch that.
I wish I could have come up with a story that was better than pulling out Thanos.
I think it was
maybe
good...
if I
want good archetypal superhero stories, you're looking at DC, like classic DC, Batman. Superman.
Oh man, he's a DC guy. Okay.
Yeah, I'm a DC guy.
I think if we compared this to the Marvel comics, then we would find a much better story than the Marvel.
I do not disagree that the Marvel comics are better than the Marvel movies. However, DC is still better.
Okay, how about the Joker instead of Thanos?
I think Joker's a much better villain than Thanos.
To exemplify what exactly? Because we mentioned with I haven't seen a ton of Joker movies.
Ooh, way to bring this back.
Joker is the personification of pure chaos. Like when they throw Joker in prison, like the name tag is just like a nameless inmate. He's never given a name. He's never given a face. He's never given a backstory in any real way.
Yeah.
There's a few attempts to do that, but by and large, he's just this nameless, bodiless embodiment. He's the embodiment of chaos. That's all that he is.
I mean, even in the Joker movie,
in his purest form.
Even in the Joker movie, even though there's a backstory there's some sort of progression that's tried to give. It's just chaos. He's the product of chaos.
Mm-hmm. Wasn't there like that one scene where he just randomly? I don't remember if this was random or not, but he just went and started stabbing guys on trains or something. I don't know
if the Joker movie is the best. Joker movie was a phenomenal movie, but it was not, I think, the best embodiment of what Joker really was. Mm-hmm. And again, you have to go back to the actual comics. You have to go back to the early animated TV series and movies for this. There's been attempts later on in the kind of film universes to give him backstories, but when you're going back to the kind of OG Joker, he is always just this nameless, terrifying embodiment of pure chaos, and he's a phenomenal villain. He is the scariest villain in any media, basically. I mean, like he's just the embodiment of
because
it.
with Joker, I don't think he even he doesn't put on the pretension of standing for anything. The thing that he stands for is standing against anything that other people stand for. And that's kind of what makes him...
He's just chaos.
Yeah.
He's just chaos incarnate.
I think there's that one scene in...
He's not even evil incarnate. He's just chaos incarnate.
I think it was the Joker movie in which... Or maybe it was one of the Dark Knights, but he destroys a drug gang or something and then ends up with like a huge stack of cash, and he just burns the entire pile of cash just to show that
some
he
men
doesn't
just
care.
want to watch the world burn.
Yes.
Right? That's the quote from the movie. He's just chaotic. He's evil and chaotic for chaos and evil's sake, and nothing else. And that makes him a terrifying villain, because he can't be bought. He can't be persuaded.
And here's a question: if the Joker is chaos for its own sake, is Thanos kind of order for its own sake? Because in my mind, I don't remember much about the movies, but he is trying to make the most orderly universe by killing off half of the population. So
in some ways he is, I think. In some ways I think Thanos could be conceived as that. And it's interesting too that a lot of these archetypal stories, the order is not the good, the final result is not order. It is the embodiment and integration of both chaos and order. And that's what's true in all the mythologies. It's true in these most fundamental stories. It is, and if you look at like Batman, if you go back to the DC example, Batman is the hero. Batman is not order incarnate.
Right.
Batman is the integration.
He's ultimately a rogue.
He's a rogue. He is chaotic, but he's also good and orderly, and he's got lines that he won't cross. He is the integration. The police are pure order, and the pure order, the police in that story aren't capable of defeating the chaos.
Mm-hmm.
What is required, the hero that is required, is the one who's properly integrated both.
It's chaos restrained.
And that's actually that's a really good point with Batman. And I think you see something similar in Death Note, where Light Yagami tries to do that. He sees that the police are way too orderly and tries to kill off all of the villains by breaking the law. But what he ends up doing is he tries to establish his own order, his own like paradise.
He ends up being the ultimate order.
Yeah,
there's no order outside of himself.
He is the order. You're right. He becomes
the god of the
law.
new world.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. That's what makes him ultimately fail. Because, oops, did I spoil it? because I
gave up after the halfway point.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting thing we've kind of uncovered here, though. We've moved beyond the hero slaying the dragon, and we're talking about chaos and order now.
Yeah.
But it's still the same story, because
it is the same story.
In the original story, right? It's not just that the hero goes out and slays the dragon. The hero goes out and slays the dragon, and then he takes part of what the dragon was guarding, the valuable part of the chaos, and he brings it back to the walled city, and he integrates it into the ruling of that city. It's the same.
And he changes things. He makes the city better. He changes them.
Yes. So it's the same story.
Because
we haven't changed the story.
Because you need to use the lessons and valuable input that you got out of the journey to integrate it into the city to make the city stronger.
Exactly. So we haven't changed the story at all.
It's not just that you. It's not that you take this set of orderly things that you have gained from the experience. No, it's actually that you take a part of the. It's like you said,
the Medusa's head. You take part of the chaos itself back.
Yes,
and you use it. You integrate it.
Because that's what happens if you have pure order and nothing but pure order. It just becomes stagnant, and that's all there is to it. It's inevitable. Every time, that's what happens.
And that's how the dragons rise outside of the city. Through the you build your walls higher and higher and higher.
Because every time you have pure order,
beyond.
There's always a wall to it. There's always a limit to it.
Mm-hmm.
There's always a point at which the pure order cannot touch.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this has been a good discussion. I think we've certainly explored some interesting corners of this so far.
Yeah, it's been interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was a...
That's a good hour of content.
Good hour of content.
Might be a little bit shorter than we did the last couple of times, but
that's okay though. It was a good conversation.
Yeah, it was. Does anybody else have any parting thoughts here on the topic? Anything at the edge of your...
I just think, Micah, you were, as always, exceedingly acceptable.
I am exceedingly acceptable.
Profoundly acceptable.
I am acceptable.
Profoundly acceptable.
You are the tech guy who sucks at everything at getting his stuff to work.
Yep.
And Josh, what are you?
He's just gorgeous.
Yeah, what am I? What am I, Micah?
I know you are, but what am I?
What is Josh?
I'm pure chaos.
You know, I'll accept that. It's the soulless ginger over there.
Time to burn this Skype call.
Time to burn it.
I wish if I ended this Skype call, it would be nice if you two died.
I'm guessing we already ended the podcast. I don't need to say let's end the podcast there because...
Well, we probably ought to still end it. Don't you think?
Should we officially end it?
Yeah, officially end it.
Because now they all know we're using Skype.
And give us the most acceptable ending you've ever given, Micah.
The most acceptable ending?
Yep.
This is the end of the podcast.
We
will post another one next week.
That was wonderful. Acceptable.
Wonderful.
Acceptable.
That was so acceptable. That was one of the most tremendously acceptable things I've ever seen.
I'm glad to know I met your...
I have fully accepted that the podcast is now ended.
Micah, you always go above and beyondly acceptable.
No, he doesn't.
You've been listening to another Philosophical Tuesday, a production of the Intellectual Stooges. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us again next Tuesday for another episode.